Will the government get out of the way and let private industry work in 2010? Here to discuss, John Tamny, editor of Real Clear Markets, Stephen Sproul, staff writer for the National Review, and my old friend Peter Schiff, president of Euro Pacific Capital and author of Crash Proof 2.0, How to Profit from the Economic Collapse. Peter, is the government going to get out the way and let the free markets work?
I sure hope they would, but it doesn't look like they will. You know, the problem is we're in a serious economic ditch here, and we're not going to get out of it if the government keeps digging it deeper. We need the government to get out of the economy, to get out of the way, and stop just diverting resources. The government doesn't have any resources. It has to take them from the private sector in order to give them back to us. And when it does that, it undermines our economy. It makes us less productive and less competitive.
But, you know, John, the interesting thing about all of this is that we keep hearing the president take these victory laps, right? You know, the GDP is up, unemployment is down, everything we're doing is working, it's working, so let's do more. How do we fight that? How do we resist that? Do we resist that, or should we?
I think we should definitely resist it. I think we need to get back to first principles. There's nothing in the Constitution that empowers the federal government to oversee economic growth. And so in that sense, I very much agree with Peter here. The government has no resources of its own, and so we need to stop empowering it by virtue of it taking money from the private sector in order to give it back. Economic depressions are a misnomer. They cannot occur if government is doing very little, and if the government would just get out of the way, the economy would be fine.
But let's get Stephen in here, though. Stephen, where do you see all of this going? Because you know, I hear a lot of people who know better, particularly professionals on Wall Street and other places, but it still seems to be falling on a deaf ear in Washington.
It absolutely is. And to get back to what you said in your opening monologue, nothing better embodies that we know better than you do what's best for you than the individual mandate in the health care bill that Congress unfortunately looks set to pass. I mean, this is going around and telling every American citizen that regardless of whether or not, according to their own cost-benefit analysis, it makes sense for them to have health insurance, which, by the way, is going to be more expensive thanks to the regulations in this bill, you have to have it. You have to have it or pay a fine. The IRS will be determining whether or not your health insurance plan is up to the government standards. And so, yeah, they're basically telling you, we know better what's good for you than you do. And we say that you have to have health insurance.
Well, you know, Peter, the thing is, though, is every time someone in the administration speaks, they speak from the same hymn sheet. And the first thing they say, hey, in January, we were losing over 700,000 jobs a month. Now we're on a cusp of creating jobs. We created the jobs as if the government did that.
Yeah, plus, you know, you also have to look at the difference between productive jobs and make work. I mean, just because we have more jobs in the government or more jobs in the service sector right now doesn't mean that our economy is better off. We're still losing the most productive jobs we have. We're shedding manufacturing jobs at an alarming rate. And, you know, just because the GDP is going up, it doesn't mean the economy is getting better. You have to look at why it's going up. Right now, GDP is rising because consumers are spending borrowed money and the government is spending borrowed money. And all we're doing is digging ourselves into a deeper hole. We're in more debt now than we were before the crisis began.
What's the danger of that?
Well, the danger is, in order to get out of this mess, we don't have enough savings in this country. We don't have enough production, enough manufacturing, and enough investment. That's what we need to do. We can't spend our way out of this crisis. We can't borrow our way out of this crisis. We have to produce and work our way out of it, and we can't do that with the government interfering in the economy.
So essentially what you're saying, though, Peter, is we have to go through a certain amount of pain as a nation. We have to suck it up as a nation and before we can really come out of this the right way.
Absolutely. But unfortunately, based on what we're doing now, we're going to have to suck up a lot more pain over a much longer period of time because the government refuses to allow the free market to function.
You know, John, I read where you actually wrote that you thought a lower GDP was actually a better sign for the economy. Explain that to me.
Well, the reason for that is what drove down the revised GDP number was a higher, quote, trade deficit. Now, to me, a trade deficit is a misnomer. They don't exist. But what they do signify in economic terms is that foreigners are complementing us with imports, not to mention that they are complementing us with increased foreign investment in U.S. companies. And so the higher trade deficit drove down GDP. And I would just add one other thing to this. I have a problem with this notion that we need to experience pain to get back on track. Implicit there is that the government propping up things that were bad for the economy is somehow helping us. I think it would be very cleansing and good for the economy to let failed businesses fail, to get rid of Fannie and Freddie and a lot of these things bringing down the
economy. But John, you would agree also
painful.
the people who worked at those failed businesses would experience a certain amount of pain. I mean, I understand where you're coming from. I know Ronald Reagan and Paul Volcker took that route, and initially their popularity went down the tubes, and America did experience a whole lot of pain before things got better.
I see what you're saying there, but I think we all agree here to stimulate any company to prop it up is to depress other aspects of the economy. So by virtue of propping up the Fannies and Freddies, the GMs, the Chryslers, we're by definition depressing other more productive sectors in the economy. So I don't buy the pain argument even there. What we're seeing is propping up failed concepts that are destroying capital. The unseen here is what businesses would sprout up out of nowhere, the Microsofts, the Googles, that would sprout up if the government were not propping up failed entities that are making us weaker, not stronger, and unhappier, not happier.
Peter?
Yeah, you know, a lot of the pain, though, is going to be for politicians. They're going to have to level with the American people and tell them the truth. Politicians are afraid that they might not get reelected if they have to deal with these issues. But sure, everybody's not going to share equally in the pain. Some people will immediately benefit if we stop artificially stimulating the economy. You know, the politicians, it's easy for them to claim credit for saving a job. But what they don't see is the jobs they destroy in the process, the more productive jobs they destroy. Sure, a lot of people are going to be upset if the government gets out of the way and lets housing prices come down and lets certain businesses fail that need to fail. But in the long run, that's the best thing that can happen to the economy, and it's not going to take that long. Free markets work pretty quickly to purge these imbalances from the economy. It might only take 6 months or a year, and then we'll have real growth. Right now, we're creating the next Great Depression, only this is going to be an inflationary depression.
Stephen, do you agree with that? Do you think that we're just right now in a direction that we can't, well, it's obvious that we're not going to turn away from this, but if we don't, we can actually create the next Great Depression?
Oh, sure. I mean, look, you know, it's not just a theoretical thing with seen versus unseen consequences either. I mean, we can actually look at what's happening with small businesses right now. They're starved for capital. On survey after survey, they list their #1 fear is the threat of more importantly, uncertain regulations. They don't know what regulations are coming down the pike now. And the reason that capital is dried up for them is because we're propping up the Fannies and the Freddies and essentially the financial institutions that failed us before.
So, Stephen, you're saying that there's a limited pool of money out there, and with the government going after so much money, it's crowding out money available for other free market enterprises.
Well, a lot of capital is locked up in some very unproductive financial giants, right, which are getting themselves healthy again by pretending that their bad assets don't exist, borrowing from the Fed at near zero rates, and then lending to the government at 2 or 3%. I mean, let's start a bank, me and you. We can make a fortune doing that, you know, and so this is why would you lend to a risky startup company when you could just make money risk-free all day? When the president called the CEOs of these major banks to chew their ear a couple of weeks ago, you know, all he wanted to do was try to lecture them about how they need to go out and lend to small businesses. And you know what all they wanted to talk about was? Underwriting more Build America bonds, helping the U.S. government borrow more. Yeah. It's a safe bet for them, and you know, so that's why small businesses can't grow and can't create jobs.
Yeah, in order for business to grow, they need capital. And capital comes from savings. And there are no savings in this country. They're being diverted to the government. They're being diverted to the financial entities. And with the Fed keeping interest rates at practically zero, who's going to save? There's no return to savings. And so everybody is just going into debt. There is no capital for small businesses because it simply is being taxed out of existence.
You think the Federal Reserve needs to start raising interest rates?
Absolutely. They are too low. We got into this trouble with low interest rates. We're not going to get out of it unless we let them rise. Now, certain over-leveraged financial institutions are not going to be able to survive in a higher interest rate environment. The government is going to have to deal with its massive liabilities and the short-term nature of the national debt. But we can't have a capitalistic economy without capital. We can't have capital without savings, and no one's going to save if they don't get paid to save.
John, you agree with that? What's your formula for turning this around? Does it include the Fed actually raising rates?
Slightly. My view is I think the Fed should float the Fed funds rate. The interest rate is what intersects supply and demand for capital, and it offends me that a central bank would try to set this rate. And so the ideal thing would be for the Fed to say, we're no longer going to set the rate, let the market set it. It probably rises higher, in which case, as Peter points out, we would get higher savings as a result. But I think the biggest factor here, and this has to come from the U.S. Treasury, is that if you want job creation, you need investment, and and a stable dollar is what drives investment. The U.S. Treasury must get serious about defining a dollar in terms of a value that will be the same today, tomorrow, as it will be 10 years from now. That is the number one thing in my mind. If you want to get the economy started again, stabilize the dollar's value.
But, Stephen, how can we do that with the Fed monetizing debt and some of these programs out there? I mean, it's really a shock, in my opinion, that the dollar's not even lower.
Well, you hit the nail on the head, monetizing the debt. I mean, what the Fed is doing, it's buying mortgage-backed securities at an astonishing pace from the agencies, Fannie and Freddie. And so what's going to happen then is when they try to, that's putting liquidity into the economy. When they try to soak that back up, the only way they can do that is to sell the mortgage-backed securities that they've purchased. But it's very unlikely that they're going to be able to get full value for those. There's going to be a lot of liquidity out there that the Fed can't soak up. That's a recipe for inflation, to say nothing of the deficits that we're running. That's $1 trillion a year, right, stretching to 10 years.
That's the trade-off that the government is making. That you can't have a strong dollar and these stimulus programs simultaneously. They're mutually exclusive. The way the government is trying to prop up the economy is by debasing the dollar, and they can't do both. So the only way we can defend our currency, and it would be great if we can define it in terms of gold the way we used to do, but that's going to immediately impose discipline on the government. They won't be able to run these huge deficits because they can't be financed, and they're going to have to back out of the financial market because that's the only way they can keep the currency sound.
So where are you then, Peter, with respect to inflation? Do you think this is going to be the big story of 2010?
You know, look, I know inflation is going to get worse in 2010, whether it's going to run out of control or it's going to take until 2011 or 2012. But I know we're going to have a major currency crisis coming soon. It's going to dwarf the financial crisis, and it's going to send consumer prices absolutely ballistic, as well as interest rates and unemployment.
What does that mean? For people watching the show, what does that mean for the average American?
It means their life is going to get a lot more difficult. It means things that they need to buy, things like food and energy, are going to be much more expensive. Ultimately, interest rates are going to rise, and their entire standard of living is going to plunge. And I'm hoping the government doesn't respond to this inflation with price controls, because that's going to make it even worse. Now you're going to be waiting in long lines to get basic food items or to get energy because there's going to be shortages. People might be going to the black market.
You're talking Zimbabwe, Weimar, Germany. I mean, you're really talking about something like that actually happening in this country.
It will happen if we don't change policies. There is still time to change. I mean, you know, I'm running for the United States Senate, so I can try to change that myself. But if we don't reverse course, if we continue to stimulate, then we will end up with hyperinflation, and it will be like Zimbabwe.
All right, guys. Well, more on what's ahead for this economy and for your money in 2010 when we come back. Santa Claus came under the cover of holiday darkness and brought government-sponsored entities the greatest monetary gift of them all: unlimited financial support for the next 3 years. It was a gift that was stealthily given as children was nestled snug in their beds, and traders were at the malls making last-minute gift purchases, and mothers were putting the final touches on those sugar plum dishes. That's right, the Treasury has given these government-sponsored entities an unlimited financial lifeline and actually removed requirements to shrink their mortgage holdings by 10% a year. So what does it all mean? It suggests that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac will need a lot more than the $400 billion that was already allotted to their recovery. Of course, though, that barely scratches the surface of all the money that's really been poured into these entities. Look at the money that has already flowed into their coffers. From Treasury, you have they've bought senior mortgage-backed securities, $111 billion worth. Enterprise mortgage-backed securities, $202 billion. Mortgage-backed securities, what's a good way of explaining it? Sort of, it's an investment that's backed up by assets held by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which for the most part are mortgages, and they try to use the cash flow to pay it off. You know, listen. It's toxic stuff, too. Let's face it. That's all that Fannie and Freddie really have, some better than others. By the way, Federal Reserve also in the act, too. They've bought $911 billion worth of enterprise mortgage-backed securities, and also they've bought debt, regular debt from these GSEs, $150 billion worth. Remember, like the health care bill, Fannie Mae was once heralded as the ultimate savior, an engine that would actually provide mortgages to low-income families. It was the centerpiece of the New Deal. In the last 9 quarters, Fannie Mae has lost $120.5 billion. Freddie, which was actually created to be a competitor, lost $67.9 billion. That's just these two entities in the last 9 quarters. It's shocking stuff, and it really makes me wonder how much healthcare is really going to cost at the end of, let's say, 10 years, 20 years. I thought my son made out pretty good with his souped-up laptop and guitar, but this is a heck of a gift, unless you're the one paying for it. Back with our roundtable, John Tammany, Stephen Sproul, and Peter Schiff. John, I want to start with you. This is just like, first of all, it was done it was like the darkness after the markets closed, everyone's shopping, everyone's getting ready for Christmas, and they pushed this through. Unlimited money from, this is nuts. Help us figure this out or understand it.
Well, perfect timing when the press are on vacation, but really are any of us surprised by this?
I am surprised by this one, John. I'm a little surprised by this one. It
was always, by virtue of their ability to issue gargantuan amounts of debt, it was always clear that the government backed these entities implicitly. Now it's explicit. And this just ensures future crises in the future, because now we know that Fannie and Freddie can continue in their undisciplined ways, and the taxpayers will back them up. But probably what offends me the most about this is we continue this bipartisan, politically correct notion that Americans are made better off if a government with no resources of its own underwrites 9/10 of all mortgages. This is an impoverishing idea that ties people to houses at a time when they need to be mobile, at a time when capital is very mobile itself. This is anti-growth, and it's just offensive that we're continuing this direction.
Peter, what do you think?
Well, you know, for years, while Fannie and Freddie were helping to inflate the housing bubble, I was publicly, predicting their bankruptcy. I did it on Fox.
You did. Listen, there were a lot of times we debated. You were right. I was wrong. Go ahead.
Charles. But, one of the things I didn't know for sure when I was making these predictions is whether the government would do the right thing and let them fail, or the wrong thing and bail them out. Well, now we know they did the wrong thing. They should have let them go bankrupt. We don't need Freddie. We don't need Fannie. They have poisoned the housing market. We need a free...
John just said that they're facilitating 9/10 of the mortgages. If they're gone, who facilitates that?
What happens is real estate prices have to adjust to the point where the private sector will finance them. The reason that there's no private money for mortgages is because real estate prices are too high. Nobody would lend their money for something
Even right now, they're too high.
Yes, they're too high. They have to be able to come down. Meanwhile, with the stroke of a pen, the federal government has transformed trillions of dollars of Fannie and Freddie paper into Treasury debt. It's now indistinguishable. So the national debt has gone through the roof, and now we have even more crowding out, because now all this debt is government guaranteed. If a businessman wants to borrow money, he can't get a government guarantee. Why is the federal government now, I think better than 95% of all the mortgages being financed right now are either being financed by Freddie and Fannie or the FHA.
Right.
The private sector is totally out.
Stephen, I don't get it. And this administration talks so much about too big to fail. I mean, when you say that it's unlimited, that they have a blank check, it can't get any bigger than that.
That's right. It's very troubling. And here's a detail that I found interesting when this story came out. At the same time, there was a story about the executives of these two companies, the CEOs of Fannie and Freddie. The details of their pay packages was released, and neither of these executives took any stock as part of their compensation. It's about $6 million apiece, and most of it's in cash, and no stock in the companies, which is very unusual for the CEO of a publicly traded company. So do you think that these guys know something that we don't?
Stephen, not only is it very unusual, but the Payzar has gone around to all of these other entities that need taxpayer money and said, listen, you've got to take a haircut. You've got to take a certain amount of money. This is beyond the pale that, by the way, $6 million that these CEOs are getting.
Yeah, that's right. And none of it in stock. So, I know that Fannie and Freddie's stock has gone up on the news that the government's giving them an unlimited credit card. But I would look at what their executives are doing, and their executives don't have any stock. Now, what I think that this means is that they know, and we should know, that this signals that the Fannie and Freddie are going to get much more aggressive about loan modifications and loan write-offs. There was a report out from Credit Suisse today that what this signals is that Fannie and Freddie are going to start buying troubled mortgages out of their MBS portfolios and aggressively writing them down. Congress, Barney Frank, is adamant that these agencies do more to mitigate foreclosures. Even if that's bad for the economy as a whole, even if real estate prices do need to fall further, even if it means more losses for the taxpayers, the most important thing is modifying these loans, preventing foreclosures, even if people borrowed way more than they can afford. So that's going to mean big losses for Fannie and Freddie. That's why I think their stocks will probably trade close to zero by the end of next year.
You know, John, what's interesting about this is that we've seen a pretty aggressive mortgage modifications already by a lot of these entities, and the failure rate is astronomical. Who's going to pay for all of this?
Of course, we're going to pay for it because, as Peter's pointed out, the government has no resources. Now, we've, of course, touched on how the weak dollar is anti-savings. Well, here's another example of how the average saver in the United States is going to be fleeced yet again. These mortgage modifications will be borne by the average person who has money in a pension fund who's invested in these safe investments because the government backs them. So here's another example where the government basically says, if you're a saver, we will attack you.
Yeah, but I mean, Peter, it's like the taxpayer who did everything right, once again, is bailing out the person that did the most irresponsible thing in the world. And at the same time, we're hearing how, you know, Wall Street was so irresponsible and everybody else is so irresponsible.
Yeah, we have our incentives backwards. It's a reverse Darwinism. It's a survival of the unfittest. The government rewards bad behavior and punishes good behavior. So how are we going to have a society where we reward people who take on too much debt, but we punish people who are frugal and save? You know, a lot of the people who are getting their mortgages modified, a lot of these people bought houses with zero down. A lot of people refinanced their mortgage so many times that they owe 2 or 3 times what they initially paid. You know, they're not getting help. They're getting this huge handout, and it's being financed by taxing either directly or through inflation the people who played by the rules, who didn't buy houses they couldn't afford, who put their money in the bank, who aren't loaded up with debt. And ultimately, this is going to destroy the currency. And if we think we have a bad economy now, just wait till we're dealing with a runaway inflation.
But, John, what I don't understand, you brought up the point that both parties have sort of been, you know, guilty in this respect. Why? What is it? What's so important about this? I mean, is it that whoever controls Fannie and Freddie, that there's just like a giant pot of money there? Why haven't either party really stepped to the plate and done the right thing with these guys?
Oh, the Republicans for years bought into this absurd notion of an ownership society, and the Democrats have always liked to redistribute wealth. Both were incorrect. The Republicans have always paid fealty to Adam Smith. Adam Smith always made clear that investment in housing was unproductive. Both parties don't understand basic economics, so they want to prop up the housing market. It's anti-growth, but neither party understands how economies grow.
Alrighty, guys. Well, 8 years after the